Started. I'm glad to see that the room is far from empty. The meeting today, the information session that the Swiss National Science Foundation has agreed to give us is important insofar as many changes that are in the process of being brought to the overall program, the funding that this most important funding agency implements are about to be brought to the way it functions. We have an important delegation. I'll let Dr. Kalt present them. The program for today, as you can see, are things that we deal with that are important for us. I look forward to hearing what will be presented from the Swiss National Science Foundation. Just so you know, the research office, for those of you who come from EPFL, the research office of EPFL will follow up with several information sessions. The dates are there. They will be posted on our website as a follow-up on how to implement, how to practically put into action these new programs. The floor is yours. And most of all, thank you for coming.
So thank you very much for these kind words of welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us and to give us the occasion to tell you what we are changing in our funding instruments. So what we will be doing today is kind of an interactive thing, which will take us about 1 hour, 3/4 of an hour, or 2 hours at most. And it will be structured in the following way. So first of all, just to keep everybody at the same level, it is about a very short introduction on the SNSF funding portfolio, then the main part on the innovations, then some things on the regulations, and questions. I'll quickly come to that in a minute. Now, two things I would like to do. First of all, I would like to present the team. So we have taken care to take office staff that comes from all of the different science domains. So there is Paul Pignat and Katharina Weder, who come from the Social Sciences and Humanities unit. And there's Stephanie Wiss, who comes from the Division of Biology and Medicine. And there's Tristan Maillard, who comes from the Division for Mathematics, Natural Sciences and Engineering. And myself, I'm Angelika Kalt. I'm the director of the SNSF since 1st of April. The second thing I would like to announce is that at the entry there you can find these cards. You've got all kinds of links there, and if you go to the web, you find it yourself. You have all of the slides under documents. Okay, so you don't need to ask for copies or anything. You can just access this by the internet. So then the idea is, when we come to the second part about the innovation, is structured in some chapters, and the idea is that we go chapter-wise, and after each chapter you can ask questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. Of course, with the number of the people in the room, that is asks for a certain discipline from both sides for precise questions and precise answers. And I would just like to say that we cannot answer questions that concern your personal situation, but we'll still be here like a quarter of an hour after the session is over, so you can take the occasion there. But also, please do not hesitate to call the office and ask your personal question. We'll be happy to answer. But just in order to treat only things here that are of common interest, I would just like to ask you to proceed in that way. Okay, so let's get going. So just a very short overview over the most important instruments of the SNSF. So here you see the SNSF budget of the year 2015, so it's approximately 900 million francs. You can see on the left-hand side how it splits up between our most important instruments. So you can see project funding here with about 50% is certainly our major instrument. You can see then that almost a quarter of our funding goes to careers. And then there is these 23% that go to programs, which are very different things, among other things also the Synergia program. On the other side, you can see how this splits up between the different domains of research. And here, important to know is that this is completely demand-driven. So, meaning we just respond to the demand that is addressed to us by the researchers. So it's about 40% biology of medicine, it's about 35% mathematics, natural and engineering sciences, and about 25% social sciences and humanities. So project funding is our core business, meaning people who are at research institutions should have the possibility to get funds to enable them to do their research. And so everybody can apply who is eligible and who has an idea for a scientific project. There are no limits concerning disciplines. There is no format that is really required. And you can cover all kinds of direct research costs that are related to your research. You can employ staff, etc. We'll come to that later. But very importantly, that does not cover the salary of the applicant. For this, we have career funding, and so here you can see how career funding splits up between the major instruments that we offer. So you can see that the big orange chunk here is the professeur boursier, which means the SNSF professorships. So as these grants are quite comfortable, that makes up an important amount of money. Then at the, let's say, career stage below, there's the Ambition instrument here in light blue, where you can also get your own salary and funds to do your research. And then this is followed by all kinds of different fellowships in principle on the postdoc level here and on the PhD level there. So this is how the money for career funding is spent. Then, of course, in the programs we have very different things. So here's an example, the national research programs. This is one of the examples, contrary to the other two things I showed you before, where people cannot freely choose topics. Everybody can apply for a national research program. It's then the confederation that hands over to the SNSF kind of a pre-choice of these propositions. We do the scientific feasibility studies, the scientific rating, and then the Federal Council chooses the topic because these national research programs are to generate scientific knowledge which is aimed at solving Switzerland's problems or, let's say, work on solutions for important societal problems. So these NRPs start about every 2 to 3 years. They take about 3 to 5 years, and the financing is very different as a function of the disciplines that are engaged in this. And there are currently about 11 NRPs running. One example is managing energy consumption. Another kind of program where you cannot really freely, bottom-up researcher choose your topic is an instrument which is an instrument for the institutions in principle. So these are the National Centers of Competence in Research, and they have another goal, another objective, which is to build up important knowledge in strategic areas for Switzerland. So it can be that Switzerland is behind in a certain area or that Switzerland is already at the top. And so these are long-term investments of about 12 years in certain research directions and research areas, which also require co-funding from the side of the universities. So here you can see a map of Switzerland, and you can see that we have quite some running. The program has started in 2005 and will be continued in the next period too. Synergia, I'll come to that later, so I'll skip it here. But just to remind you that there's all kinds of programs for international collaboration. For example, the program R4D, Research for Development, or researchers can also address demands to the SNSF to collaborate in the European research area networks. Or we have, for example, a series of bilateral programs with certain countries. This is a political choice, it's not the choice of the SNSF. So currently it's in principle the BRICS countries. Then we don't only fund research, but you can also, once you've achieved your research, you can share your research results with other people, being with other researchers, for example. So we have conference, workshop, international exploratory workshop, and conference organization grants, but we also have Agora, which is an instrument to share your results with the public. Okay, so this was a very short overview over the instruments of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and now we'll come to what will change. And we can say that we have changed project funding, we are going to change some things in career funding, and we have changed Synergia, and the rest stays basically the same. So how is this going to be structured? As I said, there are going to be several chapters, and after each one we can take questions. Maybe not after the first one, that's not so important perhaps, but there's what do we intend with these innovations? Then it's about eligibility in very general. And then it's about grant conditions and restrictions. It's about project partners, subcontracting, things like that, eligible costs, employment of staff, and then some words on the Synergia program. So you can see that we had lots of things to consider when we did this innovation, and it took us quite some time. It took us 3 years. We're in the 4th year now. In the 4th year, things are being implemented, and you'll see in a minute why things take so long. So it all started out with an internal working group that we had on project funding and on Synergia, which felt that it was time to change several things in these two instruments for various reasons, which I will not go into in detail, but one of the reasons was it was thought that project funding was not comprehensive enough, it was not flexible enough, it had too high administrative workload because grants could only go up to 3 years, but also there was a clear feeling that there was not a clear enough scientific responsibility for projects, and so on and so on. So all kinds of considerations. For Synergia, the consideration was more that Synergia had been created to really create new research, people going into other areas, people collaborating across different research areas, and that had taken place only to a very limited degree after a couple of years. So we were not quite satisfied with the results or the outcome of the impact of that program. Then, of course, it was said that you can't do any changes without asking the customers. So the next thing we did was a client survey. And in this client survey, we asked people about how they were funded by their institutions. We asked them about how they liked project funding and Synergia. And we also started already to launch some ideas on how project funding and Synergia could change, and people could tell us if they thought that was a good idea or not. So it was a quite comprehensive client survey we carried out. I think it was then, and the results were there in 2013. At the same time, we also had the idea that we had lots of different regulations and we had to put some order in this, and there was a very complicated situation which I will explain to you later. Then laws changed, so the Act on the promotion of research and innovation changed. We had a new coordination law for the Swiss universities. So all of these things had to be taken into considerations anyhow in our regulations. And then you may remember there was a Federal Council's report on the situation of young researchers in Switzerland, which came out now, I think it's 2 years ago. And so there the situation of the young researchers in Switzerland was examined, and it was said that it was not a good situation and there were things that had to be done, particularly concerning the postdoc stage at the universities. Many postdocs, not enough perspective, weakly defined stage postdoc. Okay, and then at the same time we work in kinds of 4 years periods with the Confederation where we get our money. It's the same thing for all institutions, also for EPF, for the University of Lausanne or for Geneva. And so that fell within the preparation phase of the multi-annual plan, and so all of these things came together, and at the end we had to come up with a coherent funding portfolio which took into consideration all of these things. So now for the innovations in general, what can we say, what are the most important objectives? So clearly respond to researchers' needs, that's always the intention of the Swiss National Science Foundation, but of course you can't see that necessarily on an individual scale, but you have to see that more on a global scale. So our philosophy is not to have instruments that fit for small groups, but to have large instruments flexible enough that fit for almost everybody. Then we thought that we should really provide a clear and well-coordinated funding portfolio specifically for young researchers. They would have to know at what stage of their career they could come to which instrument, which wasn't very clear before because there was lots of overlaps. And due to the report of the Federal Council, one of our main objectives was also to help young researchers to get independent, scientifically independent as early as possible in order to have better career chances. We also want to create clear responsibilities with regards to scientific merits, meaning that the role of the applicant of a proposal towards the SNSF needs to be well defined and comes along with certain responsibilities. Promote diversity, meaning to avoid the accumulation of funds on certain groups or certain people in order to be able to fund more broadness in science. And then to reduce administrative work, not only for the Swiss National Science Foundation, but also for the applicants, of course. Allow more flexible use of funds. bring the project duration closer in line with the duration of the PhD thesis, which was not the case before, and have fairly clear rules for submitting proposals and using grants. Unfortunately, we are an organization where everything has to be written in rules. So our rules rely on the Federal Research and Innovation Promotion Act, and then we have the general funding regulations here, which are kind of the basic regulations. And we had to change these, and they have to go to the Federal Council. And so it took us 2 years for this procedure, although we weren't really slow. And there's one step in here which I would like to point out, because some people say, now you have new rules for project funding, so you have more rules than before. In fact, project funding was hidden in these rules before, meaning that every time we wanted to change something for project funding, we had to go to the Federal Council, meaning that there were 40 years where there was nothing changed because you had to go to the Federal Council. So now project funding has its own regulations, which is kind of a level lower, and its own, and as other instruments do too. And so if we want to change something again in project funding, that can be much more easily done than before. And then we also have the general implementation rules, kind of at the same level, meaning here, for example, we have more like technical things, also employment of staff, but also we spell out the rules here that are very general in a more specific way so that people know what the SNSF practice is. Okay, so this is the work we had to go into, and this is also one of the reasons why things sometimes take a bit longer than you think. So I think I'll move on to the next chapter, and then afterwards we can take questions, if that's okay for you, unless there's a burning question on what I just told you. Does not seem to be the case, so let's move on. So what is the idea now between for general eligibility criteria? Here I'm not talking about project funding, but in general, the instruments of the SNSF. The instruments of the SNSF should be basically for people working in Swiss research institutions, and that has to be kind of written in the rules. So this is why there are some rules that are more precise today than they were before, meaning that people should have more than only a loose link to the institution in order to be able to go for funding for the Swiss National Science Foundation, because it is very important that they have an institutional embedding, they have access to infrastructure and all of these things, so that's a very important point for the Swiss National Science Foundation. So this is more precisely spelled out now. And also, there are some institutions that are satellite institutions outside Switzerland, so there are also rules for that now. And we have one change here, which is quite important, because when you look at our rules today, we say, okay, you need to have a position in order to apply. This will no longer be necessary. You just have to come up with some kind of a credible statement from the institution that you will have a job when this project will come to life. And then you just have to prove that you will be employed for the entire time of the project. But even there, we make exceptions for people who are considered to be young researchers on a career path. So for example, when somebody doesn't have an employment contract for all over the time, we trust people. We say, okay, the institution has chosen you on a position, meaning that you have good career chances, so we give you the grant, and then afterwards, for example, when you move to another institution, there is no problem with the SNSF anyhow. You can take your grant anywhere you go, inside or outside Switzerland, if it's an institution that doesn't work for commercial purposes, of course, because this is something that the SNSF can certainly not fund. So this is a kind of a loosening of rules that we currently have, and we think that this will enable younger people to have better access to the funding instruments of the SNSF. So just being a bit more precise on what your tie to an institution should be means that the research activity, along with any teaching, because we accept the unity of teaching and research, of course, should constitute about 50% full-time equivalents. There are exceptions, for example, clinicians working at hospitals who do research in the framework of their activity, they can have employment rates that are lower. Or somebody, for example, working in an archive doing research, and so there are situations where you can deviate from that. And so, meaning if you have just a title delivered by an institution, like for example, honorary professor or other things that just just an expression of a link you have, that is not enough to be able to go for SNSF funding. You need to correspond to these conditions here. So this is maybe not so interesting. It's just a precision of what I said before. There has to be a strong tie to Switzerland. So meaning that normally the employment that somebody has who can apply has to be in accordance with Swiss law. So if you're, for example, employed in a satellite of an institution, a Swiss institution somewhere, and this institution functions entirely under the law of another country, then this is not possible. But if you have a Swiss working contract, yes. Then the administration of the research project in Switzerland, address, and there are certain institutions that are not eligible. As I said, the Swiss National Science Foundation cannot fund any research for commercial purposes, so there are institutions that are effectively not eligible for going for funds for, at the Swiss National Science Foundation. Now, everything I said before is general. It doesn't only apply to project funding, but it applies, for example, also to programs. But now I'm saying something here which is specific for project funding. So we were also thinking about young people in project funding, because up to now they had competed with all kinds of established people in project funding, because the rules said you had to have a couple of years of scientific experience after your PhD, and it was never clear what kind of experience you would have to have. So also in the light of offering very clear instruments for each career stage, we propose to have the instrument, or we will do it this way, Ambitionen and project funding will be complementary. Meaning that for project funding, it will be required that you have 4 years scientific experience after your PhD. If you have less, you go to the Ambitionen instrument, and the Ambitionen instrument will be changed. At the moment, the Ambitionen instrument is such that it comes only with a salary, meaning that only people can apply who want a salary in research funds at the same time. Now we will open it for people, young people, who have employment at the university, who don't need a salary and who just need research funds. Meaning that they will only compete among each other, same age group, academic age group, in this instrument. And we will also put more funds into the Ambitionen instrument than before, because we enlarge kind of the spectrum of customers that we can have. So this is kind of the deal between these two things. And of course, there are, as always, exceptions, because there are, for example, disciplines where directly after your PhD you get an assistant professorship. Of course, we will not ask you to go into this Ambitionen scheme, because Ambitionen is for getting independent, and if an institution has already found that you are advanced enough to have an assistant professor position or something similar, we accept you in project funding. Okay, so if you have a position that is independent, meaning where you can really be responsible for your own grant and you can manage your own grant, then you can go to project funding even if you have less than 4 years experience. Okay, so this is a very important change to project funding. Okay, so here I'll not go through these, because the titles of positions are very different from one university to the others, and so if you have doubts, please always call. But there's a number of positions that I think we can consider to be independent, like full professors, assistant professors, chief consultants, senior staff physicians, senior scientists, and so on and so on. Okay, but of course these things may be called differently from one institution to the other. But then there are also some positions that are definitely not eligible. For example, if you're a postdoc, per se, SNSF definition, you work in the project of somebody else, meaning for us you're not really independent. So you cannot at the same time be employee in a project and have your own SNSF grant. So either you're a grant holder and an applicant, or you're a postdoc. But of course, as a postdoc, you can apply for the time afterwards very clearly. Research associate, assistant physicians, employees in SNSF projects, as I said, Ambitionen grantees, and the SNSF professors in the first 2 years do not fulfill the eligibility criteria. With the SNSF professors, the thing is that they should concentrate on their grant in the first 4 years, then they can go for project funding. And then it's not too late, because as I said before, we can give a project even with a running time of 4 years, even if the person has a contract that is ending before. Okay, if there are some positions where we will have to check. For example, if you're just at the title of an honorary professor, then it doesn't work. But if you're a honorary professor and you have an employment of 50% at the institution, then of course it works. Same for lecturer and so on. Okay, I think I'll stop here. So this was about the eligibility, first in general, and then the eligibility to project funding. And we're happy to take questions from your side. I just have trouble seeing you because it's so dark over there, so okay.
Just to make it clear, if you're an assistant professor, you can then apply in both project and in Ambizione?
No. Ambizione is clearly not the level of assistant professor. Ambizione is the level below. Ambizione is the instrument where you can get independent, because that's always a crucial thing.
Even if the professor is has received his PhD less than 4 years.
Yes, that's what I said before. So if you're at an institution and you get an assistant professorship, for example,
you go to
you go to project funding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think there's two questions here, and one in the back. No? Sorry, but it's really hard to see from here.
Yes, will you say something about the co-applicants? For example, for project fundings, they have to meet the same requirements as the main applicant?
I think this will still come later, but I can answer this now. So that is already the case today. So we don't make a difference between a main applicant and other applicants. It's just that one person is a corresponding applicant. And so this will be kept, this principle, but we are saying that, so that will come later. We have another status now for people who just do a minor contribution to a project. So we only want to see people as grant holders or as applicants who will really have the responsibility of the project, or the spiritus rector of the project. But that will come later. Okay?
So, are there people who previously were allowed to apply for project fundings and who now cannot anymore?
Do you want to answer, Tristan?
Yes, there are, especially young researchers. But now, this is our intention that those persons can get funds and are in a competition where they are compared with persons at the same stage of their career. And those persons will mainly go to Ambizione.
Okay, so but beyond young researchers, the people who previously were allowed to apply for funding should still be allowed to do that?
Yeah, maybe you want to comment on retired professors?
The regulation for retired professors have changed. Until now, a person who was not an honorary but an emeritus had the possibility to submit a proposal if the institution agreed to pay 20% of the entire project, and if they were outstanding, the highest grade. And now the regulation has changed. The person, after the end of his career, or when he is emeritus or honorary, he can submit a proposal if he has a 50% employment at an institution.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if I could follow up just on, since it was that subject about retired professors.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be something incongruous between the idea of being retired and having a 50% employment. And I'm wondering what the political reason was for, since I'm reaching retirement, for making it more restrictive for retired people.
Okay, so always at the SNSF, there was the philosophy that if somebody is retired, beyond the age of retirement, okay, it would kind of be necessary to prove that, first of all, this person was absolutely excellent and that it had the support of the university in order to be able to continue. And now we're saying, okay, the support of the university, because it didn't work in the past, the support of the university is an employment for a certain percentage. And we don't say that the person has to be excellent, because that also turned out to be, well, let's say in practice kind of difficult. You had to evaluate the proposal, sometimes, you know, with like 3 applicants and one of them falling in the retirement age. And so if that proposal wasn't rated in the best 10%, then it wasn't granted. Although if there hadn't been a retired applicant, the project would have been funded. So that led to kind of very weird situations. So this is why we try to do that in a more comprehensive, in a better understandable and more clear way.
But it's legal to be employed by a university? Like
of course, yeah, yeah.
People?
And so this for us is the signal that the university supports you.
So
yeah.
I don't think you cannot be in a place when you
okay,
are retired.
Okay, maybe we can take that up afterwards, but I think there are 2 or 3 other questions here. So let's come back to that after our, okay?
Yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in 2 universities, Geneva. My salary is just for teaching. I had a research project as principal investigator. Now, my question, I would like to know whether I can still apply for projects. It's not very clear to me.
Okay, so I would also like to ask you that we handle this afterwards, because this is about your personal situation, so I'll be happy to answer that. But in principle, senior researchers, as you said, are as you saw, are considered to be eligible. But it depends on in what situation you are, so I wouldn't like to answer that in this short way, so we can do it afterwards, okay?
So currently, a senior researcher who is applying for a project is not allowed to have a reference to his results which are more than 5 years old, to allow some fair comparison with young researchers. So since we now get rid of young researchers, are we allowed to refer to our old results?
Well, I would say to get rid of young researchers is not really the good expression, because there's lots of money from the side of the Swiss National Science Foundation being put into young researchers. But your question is about the competition within project funding.
So the question is, can we make any reference to our results which are more than 5 years old?
Oh, okay. You want to answer?
Okay, here there are 2 ways to answer that question. The first is that your CV and list of publication or list of outcome of your research has 2 objectives. The first objective is to know whether you have the competence for the project you've submitted. If you are able to perform in the research, in the project, in the topic you want to have funds. And the second objective is to know what is your output in the last years, whether you have been productive, and if your track record compared with other researchers is excellent. And for the first part, of course, if you have been working in the same area as the one of your project before the 5 years period, of course it is related to the project and it's useful to keep it. But for the analysis of your track record, we restrict to the last years, because we want the person to be productive in the recent years.
Okay, I don't know, are there still other questions?
In EPFL, for example, you have many unities that are directed by a professor. Is this possible, for example, a research associate in a unity apply without the professor as the applicant?
Okay, it depends on the constellation you have, but normally if you're, you say associate professor?
A research associate.
Okay, so all depends on if your position is one that allows to do independent research, and research associate normally are within a group, and so you do research in a team and normally guided by a professor. So at least that's the setting that we have in mind. But there may be exceptions. So again, ask about your personal situation afterwards.
It is not my personal situation, it's a general question because you mentioned that research associate cannot apply.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that, or the idea is that if there is a grant by the SNSF given to a person, we have to be sure that the person is independent in the sense that the person can do the research he or she wants and has asked the SNSF for, and that he can manage his or her own grant, and that the grant isn't going into some large pot of money somewhere with the larger unit and disappears for all kinds of research, but not what is written on the project.
So that means that in addition to the employees during the duration of the project, the researchers should be also independent. So it is an additional. Yeah,
project funding has always been the instrument for somebody who can do his or her research independently. And there was always discussion about when can you do this, under what condition, and we think we've simplified this a bit now because we have Ambitionen and project funding arranged in a complementary way. So of course there are always cases where you have to discuss, but I think we have now found a better solution for this than we had before. So this was always the question, that's not new. Okay. Yes.
I'm asking a question about the track record, since it was mentioned. Is the track record completely reassessed at every project submission, or do you keep yourself track of us?
We're not watching you. But of course, it's like every time proposals come in, it's a new game. So, and two of the criteria which we have for evaluating proposals refer to the applicant. So every time this is re-examined and it plays a role and it is being rated compared to others, because also the competition field is probably different every time. So yes, it is. Yeah, it's reassessed every time. Mm-hmm. Question here?
Just a question regarding the 5-year publication rule. Does it also apply to women who have had children recently?
Okay. Who would like to answer that one?
It is, yes, we are looking only at 5 years, but we take into consideration particular situations. One of the possible situations is that a person had, for instance, industrial experience. In the last 5 years, he went to Kudelski, to Bayer, to Google, and worked for 3 years there. And of course, he was not able to publish. And that we take into consideration. And of course, if the person, because of some motherhood or some other situation like a long illness, we take that into consideration when evaluating the track record of the person.
So to maybe still a remark on that. So the 5 years stay, but it is taken into consideration if you have specific conditions. Okay, so this is being accounted for in evaluation. And the other remark I would like to make is that, of course, publications are very important in many research fields, but there are other products of scientific productivity and work that the SNF recognizes too. And the SNSF has recently signed the DORA Declaration, which is the San Francisco Declaration on the Assessment of Research. And for the October project funding, we will come up with something that is different than today. Today we have a CV and a publication list, and what we will have then, if we make it until then, is a CV which is quite formal, and then it's an achievement list. So you can list all kinds of scientific achievements, not only publications, and then there's the publication list of the last 5 years. So we're trying to see this in a very much broader context, and so you can put forward all kinds of things that you have done. Okay, I think we should move on. Okay, one question still, and then I think we should move on.
My question is just for young research and postdocs. So what happens to the he have to apply to Ambition, and how long is it for 2 years? If it is allowed, Ambition is a postdoc program for 3 years or 2 years.
Okay.
Allowed on the 4th year, it's only allowed on the 1st and 2nd year because normally the number of years.
You can apply from 1 to 4 years after your PhD, and it's for a grant of 4 years.
A grant of 4 years.
Yeah.
So even in the last year of the postdoc, officially last year, 4th year, he can apply for another 4, even if it's not allowed by the rules of human resources to stay 8 years in EPFL.
No, you always have to comply with the rules of your institution.
Yeah, so it all depends also, this has to be negotiated with the professor in charge.
Well, Ambizione is not necessarily the instrument thought to stay at the institution where you already are.
Yeah, but the reality of the fact is at a certain point the postdoc arrives at the 3rd year and he has to negotiate if he can stay.
Well, the question is, if you do have to do a postdoc of 3 years before going to Ambizione, we encourage people to go through Ambizione relatively early in their career.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, it's advisable to go on 1st and 2nd year.
Yeah. So Ambizione is for working in Switzerland. So after your PhD, you can, for example, do 1 or 2 years of postdoc abroad somewhere, and then you come back and do an Ambizione. So the next chapter is going to be about grant conditions. So as you have already gathered, I think from all kinds of information we gave, the maximum grant duration is now 4 years, instead of 3. That doesn't mean that you have to go for 4 years grants, but if you can, you should, because it facilitates the life of everyone, your life, and also the life of the SNSF. And it is also much better adapted to the duration of PhDs. Then there is a minimum grant duration, so no grant below 1 year. There is no fixed maximum amount for grants, but if you want, this was largely discussed in the Research Council. Disciplines are very different, their needs are very different. If you want to get a picture on what the average grant size is, you can go to our public database, the P3, and there we have a very new visualization of all kinds of things, and among other things you can look at what the average grant size in a certain discipline is, and so on, and how much the SNF spends for it. So it's very easy to get an idea of the grant sizes that the SNSF normally have, but formally there is no limit. Then we have something that is called excellence grants, and which is until now only practiced in the Division for Biology and Medicine, and which will be extended to all of the divisions, meaning the following thing. If you hand in a proposal and your proposal is rated in the first or the second category, meaning very high quality, then what can happen is if the research is, for example, a research that can be continued, there is research that has to end after 2 years, then you can receive an invitation for so-called excellence grant, meaning that then you have a simplified procedure for handing in the grant. There's, as a rule, no external evaluation, but only evaluation in the Research Council. And so you can have this with a combination of 3 + 3 or 4 + 4. If you go for a 2 years grant, we're not going to do this because we say, why don't you go for a 4 years grant? So this is also a way of avoiding too much administration, too much reviewing of grants that in principle don't need to be reviewed. But it's upon invitation, because it also depends on if your current project is running well. So if the current project is not running well, you will not be invited to an excellence grant. But the information, you will receive it directly with the decision on your project, and then you will be recontacted again when time comes to apply for a follow-up. Okay, so this has nothing to do with the fact that anybody can ask for a thematic continuation of what he or she has already done. Of course, this is possible, but all of these grants will be evaluated in the normal routine. In the past, there was some confusion about this, and so we think this is handled in a much more easier way now. Okay, now, as I said, we would like to fund diversity and have very clear responsibilities. So the principle is that people should, if possible, concentrate on one grant, and if this is not at all possible, they should have at maximum 2 grants. If the second grant is for a research subject which is really entirely different from the first one, and if the person can make a substantial contribution to the second project as well. So that means at maximum 2 projects, the rule should better be concentrated on 1 project. Now, coming back to the question that was asked before about the applicants, there's no formal restriction about the number of applicants, but as I said, the SNSF would really like to have only people who are the spiritus rector of the project, who do very substantial, important contributions, who supervise the staff, and so on, and who are responsible for the results too. And so, of course, this is allowed if it makes sense and if it is necessary in order to attain the project goals. A question often asked is, if I have a lead agency project with another country, does that also count as a normal project? Yes, it does. But, of course, if it's your second project and it's thematically completely different, then it is possible. Okay? Now, just to remind you that this is a restriction that refers only to project funding, within project funding, and researchers still have all kinds of possibilities to go for different funding instruments of the SNSF, for example, Synergia, National Research Program, NCCRs, and so on and so on and so on. So the restriction is not very severe. Okay, maybe I'll do this one and then we come to a question round again. Now, sometimes people have the impression we only want 1 person on 1 grant and see nobody else as co-applicants. That's not true. As I said before, if the project requires it, you can of course have co-applicants, and I said what is expected from them. Now, of course, every project where you're co-applicant or applicant, as we don't make a difference between these 2 counts in this game. So, of course, it is very clear that if you would like to collaborate in a project where you only have a minor contribution or something, then you can do this, and we would like to kind of give this a certain visibility by introducing the status of a project partner, meaning that you can benefit from the funds of the project, you can also be named in the project, but you're not a responsible applicant. I'll come back to that later. In the same way, you can also, for example, go for subcontracting of certain parts of your project, but it is very clear that there are restrictions on this, because what the SNSF doesn't want is that the project is being mandated to other people and being carried out almost entirely by other people than the applicants and their staff. So project partner, what does that mean? So the person makes a scientific contribution, can be at a public, private or commercial research institute in a company, but not for commercial purposes. So usually this should be limited to about 20% of the project costs, but as always exceptions are possible. And the project partner cannot employ staff via the SNSF project, so that's a limitation. Subcontracting, contrary to project partners, is more like buying services, where people don't make an intellectual input into the project, but where you have to dispose of certain services. You can buy them in until about 10% of the project costs. Okay, and of course, as always, the services and costs should be proportionate and economical. So maybe I stop here and we take questions. There's one over here and one over there sitting. There's one over there. Ah, sorry.
The fact that you extended the duration to 4 years is not, I mean, it's going to simplify a lot administratively and everything, but it's not really going to solve the problem of the duration of the thesis, because I mean, if I apply for for funding for 3 PhD students starting from October 1st, then very likely at least 1 or 2 of them will not start exactly on October 1st, because you have to find people and so on. So at some point there's going to be nevertheless some mismatch so is this going to introduce restrictions on the follow-up? So if I have to ask then for a few months left for finishing PhDs? I mean, is this going to make the follow-up more difficult? How are you going to handle this?
Tu veux?
To answer your question, maybe I would say that you can always ask for a continuation grant and require the money which you need to allow the person to finish the thesis on the new grant. So in this respect, and as I can talk for our division, that was always the case and it stays the same.
Yes, but
it's for those who can start at the beginning, that will help for sure.
Yeah, but if you combine this with the typical amount, which is more or less defined by your averages, and if you combine this with the restriction of no more than one project, then I'm afraid that when you ask for the follow-up and you have to finish a few ongoing things, this will restrict on the new projected.
Okay, actually no, there is a part in our regulation that says that if a project has to be continued or prolonged,
extended.
Because of the end of the thesis, this doesn't restrict you in submitting a further proposal on a different topic.
Okay.
And therefore, say you need 6 more months for a PhD to end the thesis, then you can ask for a small prolongation of that particular project, and it will not restrict you in submitting a project on a different subject.
Okay, but you cannot ask for additional money on that prolongation. So,
yeah, but in the case you are mentioning, the money will be on the grant because you have used it at the beginning of the grant duration. And therefore here the money will be available and you can prolong it without any problem.
We will come back to this point later because there may also be other reasons than late employment which can lead to circumstances as you described them. I don't know here, I think.
Yeah, it's regarding the for-profit condition because it's a bit unclear to me. Like if I have a project and then one of the partners is a company and is providing some materials, for example, and then in the future they may use the outcome of the research to integrate in a new project and make money, this is a problem for you or not?
We can fund no research for direct commercial purposes. It's very simple.
So basically you restrict just for basic science, not for applied.
Well, that's our main
research.
task at our institutions. We do fund also some applied research and some use-inspired research, of course, but it ends there where there is a direct commercial purpose linked to it. Very clearly, that's the CTI or a sister organization who's then responsible for that.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a question in the back, but I think there's one here.
One question related to the possibility of having a co-applicant. So, in case the 2 applicants contribute substantially, I understand that this is possible, but still within one single division. Is that correct? Or could it be 2 applicants from 2 different divisions, which brings us back into the in a way older multi-division project?
There's no restriction regarding the divisions. You can combine the 2 divisions. You just have to think about the leading division and then submit it like that.
Okay, and if it's really an interdisciplinary proposal, you go to the Synergia, to the new Synergia instrument. We'll come back to that later. Je sais pas qui était premier.
Par rapport à, sorry.
No, you can ask in French if you want to. Feel free.
Can you come back when you say that you could apply for other fundings if you already have a project, and then there you didn't list the lead agency, but you listed the lead agency in the previous slide. So is a lead agency project considered as SNSF research project as those that are limited, or as one that is a complementary project?
As those that are limited. So meaning that if you have a lead agency, that per se does not allow you to have an additional project. But if your lead agency is a project that differs thematically from the one that you already have, you can have a second one as a lead agency, but not a third one just because it's a lead agency. So it does count. Okay? But on the other hand, as you will see afterwards, there will be much more facility for involving international partners in an informal way in the project. So we open very much up for international collaboration. That answers your question? Okay.
Under what condition can the co-applicant still submit a second project?
Who wants to answer that one, Paul?
He can apply for another project if the second project is very different. The role of applicant and co-applicant is the same, so the limitation is also the same.
So if the co-applicant is making, let's say, a smaller contribution than the main applicant, is there this possibility of the subcontracting or a collaborator or something like that possible?
It depends on the role of the co-applicant in the project. If it's only a minor contribution, he can be recommended to be a project partner.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you.
Almost along the same lines, because now it would seem more practical to have what previously was a co-applicant as project partner. However, it's not clear to me, here it says can charge corresponding costs. So the project partner, of course, will have an employee who carries out part of the work. No?
No.
Okay, if I have a colleague and he has an employee, and that employee carries out some measurements in my project.
He sends you a bill.
He sends me a bill, yes. And now with that bill...
But his employee is not on the project payroll.
I know. Yeah. The employee is not on the project, but he sends me a bill for the man hours spent doing this measurement and for the cost of the machine used. Yes?
Exactly.
And now he's allowed to put that money into an account, and out of that account he is employing as an EPFL employee, not as an SNSF employee. He's employing his co-worker.
Okay, so the idea is that the project partner, as it's a minor contribution compared to an applicant, should not employ staff on the payroll of the project, because then that would be a role of the co-applicant.
No, that's that.
Okay, so within the framework of about 20% of the project costs, your project partner, who has to make a kind of an intellectual commitment to the project, so it's not buying a service, okay, he or she could benefit from the funds up to 20% by sending you a bill for however he or she manages to come up with the service or let's say the research that he or she is doing. But it's for research. It's not, you know, for buying things or for having analysis done or so on. So these people have a certain visibility. So for example, when you go to my SNF, you enter them in the mask. And so the SNSF also knows that money is going there, for example, and so should be careful with that status. It's not, you know, every tiny thing done in a project doesn't need that. There's lots of, as we will see later, lots of possibilities to collaborate in a less formalized way.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
This limitation of 1 grant per applicant, it's for purely Swiss project or like for DAR projects with foreign partners? Can we have a Swiss National Science Foundation project purely Swiss plus others with other countries?
It depends. If it is an ERANET, it doesn't count in the restriction we have in project funding. But if it is a lead agency, it counts. Said differently, if you have a project you've submitted with Germany on in a usual project funding without any thematical restriction, here it counts in a restriction we have. But if you submit a proposal in one of the thematically constrained schemes we have, such as ERANETs, here it doesn't count in our restriction.
The philosophy is we don't want to impede people to take part in programs that are thematically constrained, for example. But The lead agency procedure is restricted to project funding by contract with the different organizations with which we have it. And so it's got exactly the format and the same idea, bottom-up blue sky research, and so it counts.
So you are talking to the leading house with Korea?
You have DAO projects, Deutschland, Austria.
Yeah, these are the lead agency projects.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. But we don't only have them in the framework of DACH with Germany and Austria. We also have them with France, for example, with the ANR. We have them with Luxembourg, and we may have them with Belgium soon. Okay. So I don't know who's next, and yeah, and then there's another question.
Thank you. What about if you have a synergy and a simple project going on? Could you ask for another simple project funding?
If it is thematically very different from what you have running, yes. Okay.
So going back to the cost and the grant size, how does this influence selection of projects? Are small projects compared to other small projects, or are they compared to
Who would like to answer that? Stephanie?
Also related to that, is there any preference for the staff and the project? Do you prefer PhDs as staff or over postdocs, or is there any preference?
Okay. Two questions.
Okay, it's not a question of a preference, it's a question of the competitive evaluation that we make, and it's the quality of the project which is assessed according to the criteria. So we're not pooling the projects depending on the size, not pooling them according to what they want to do, who is going to be hired if the project is accepted. It's really as a whole. And of course, we are looking in terms of people to be hired, if this is appropriate for the realization of the project.
Okay, but to be very clear, the CV of a person that you would like to employ is no criteria for the evaluation of the project, because very often the projects come with NN. People don't even know whom they're going to apply in the project. So, and preference, of course, we don't have a preference in the evaluation, as was said, but we have a certain consciousness concerning the so-called postdoc bubble, and so that will come later. We should take some care not to have too many postdocs on the SNSF process, but it's in no way any kind of evaluation criteria if you ask for this or for that, in size neither. Unless you're asking for completely, outrageous things that don't make sense, then yes.
So is it possible to ask for more funds during the project? For example, if there is a possibility to hire a postdoc or a PhD student that is interested in the topic, before we could simply apply for another grant, and now is it possible to just extend the grant?
Okay, who wants to take that question?
If there is something that has not been foreseen, like something is broken, one of your instruments is broken, here we may consider giving more funds. But here our philosophy is for you to present us what you want to do for the next 4 years. And we give you the flexibility to use the funds we are allocating you, but we will not give you more money for the project you received.
Still more questions? There's one here.
I have another question with regard to this one project limitation. So how is it going to work in the transition period? If I have a project with the previous skills still running, does it mean that I cannot apply until this project finishes?
Who would like to? That's for you? Okay.
The transition period is indeed important, because in some fields like engineering sciences, in the past, it was a tradition to have several grants running at the same time. And we don't want to impede those persons to submit grants in October. And therefore, if you are in this situation where you currently have several grants running, we encourage you to contact us. and we discuss with you possibilities for transition measures. It is difficult for us to present here general statements, but we might consider case-by-case solutions.
Okay, and then I have another question. So, if I'm supposed to run one project, let's say of duration of 4 years, and when I want to hire some PhD students, does it mean that my project starts, I have to hire, I don't know, 2 PhD students, and then basically I cannot hire any other PhD student on FNS money in the middle of the project, so that creates some sort of a very much uneven distribution of PhD students in my group, or I don't know how.
Okay, to be clear, we don't fund PhD students, we fund a research project. And
yes,
you have a full flexibility in the use of funds you have, given the rules of what is eligible cost, of course. But then you have the flexibility to use your funds the way you want. And given this flexibility and the duration of the project, you are the person responsible for the use of the money that has been allocated to you. Of course, as it has been already said before, if it happens that one of the PhD starts 6 months after the start of the PhD, of the project, sorry, in that case, you might receive a prolongation without more cost at the end of the project. That is possible.
Okay. Are there other questions? Okay.
For example, if we have some hole in a salary of a PhD student, can that salary money, could that be employed to, for example, to pay internships or master students?
So the question is how flexible you are with the funds. That will come up later. In principle, you have more flexibility than before. So if you, for example, you plan your project and you say you want a PhD student, then, for example, you discover that some things don't work or that a PhD student is not available that you would like to have, you can dispose otherwise of the funds that you have on the project, but still always with the project goals being defined. So you cannot just, go in an entirely different direction or do other things, but you have more liberty with the funds you get. It's going to be I'm come back to that later, it's going to be a global budget which you get from the SNSF. Still questions? Yes, I think there's a hand over there. Here I don't see anyone.
No. So in the past I had the experience with a SNF project which was running and which was cut because the PhD student who was paid by this project was going beyond the so-called normal duration of a PhD. Also he was granted for an extension by the doctoral school. So do I understand well that this case will not occur anymore, that we can continue to pay PhD students who are still employed by EPFL after their normal duration of a PhD?
Okay, I'm not sure if I get your question right. This is going to come when we come to employment of staff. So there are rules for the duration of employment at the SNSF and there are rules at the institutions. And so the minimum counts. Okay, if EPFL has a stricter rules than the SNSF, then that applies. And if the SNSF has stricter rules than the EPFL, then that applies. But I don't quite get, your project was cut because the PhD student you wanted to employ was already like in his 3rd or 4th year or something like that.
So the PhD student was 4 years after enrollment and he was granted an extension, but SNF didn't want to pay for after the extension.
Yeah, we have this 4-year rule and that will not change. There will be certain exceptions which I will come to just in a minute, but we stick to the rule of 4 years for PhD students.
I'm sorry. This is an important problem in some schools here. Some schools here have 1 year where students are not on a project. So in practice, we never managed to pay with the funds from Fond National more than 3 years our students. So we lose automatically 25% of the potential contribution of SNF. And I don't understand why this has to be.
Okay, we come exactly to this point afterwards, okay? So I would propose, if there is not another question, just to proceed, because that will answer your question. Okay. Okay, so first, before that, the eligible costs. Okay, so there are all kinds of eligible costs. I will not go into all of the details, but of course, there's things that don't change. You can still employ people on your projects, their salaries and social contributions paid. Conferences and workshops, collaborations, that is new. Direct costs for infrastructures also, and costs of scientific open access publications we already have. Okay, and so the classical research costs also, that stays, material of literary value and so on. And then we have this, but it's very little used. That's why I'm going to go into it again. It's costs for career measures. So conferences and workshops. Until now, it has been fairly restrictive in project funding. On the other hand, we have two international instruments for scientific collaboration, the international exploratory workshops and the international short visits, and we have an instrument to finance workshops and conferences. So the idea is that if you have a workshop that is really related to your project, please put the costs in there and don't apply separately. So we will only keep these smaller instruments for people who don't have a grant in project funding or in any other instruments and who are not able to include their costs in their project. So that should simplify the lives of quite some people. And so these are all the kinds of costs that can be paid. But there's just one thing should be noted. This is not an instrument to finance like huge congresses or something like that. It's really for scientific exchange in the course of workshops and conferences that are of human size and that fit well into the project goals. Okay, so now collaborations. This comes to several questions concerning lead agency before. So lead agency or the DACH agreement are formal agreements between different research funders across Europe at the moment, and they are very difficult to have, and they come along with very, well, let's say rules that are sometimes not very pleasant. For example, when we do the lead agency with the ANR, we have to apply a success rate of what, 15%? Actually, and also with Austria we have to apply this kind of success rate, and so we were looking for ways in which people could, like in Synergia, but not maybe to that extent, collaborate with people from abroad. Then you can do that. You can just, you know, for example, link up to another project that is in Switzerland or outside Switzerland. You can claim for more travel costs, but also for some additional research costs. Then this is also new. Up to now we haven't been paying for the cost of the use of infrastructures, but it's a very, let's say, difficult subject, because what the SNSF should pay are only the direct costs for the use of infrastructure that are related to the SNSF projects. Now, this is a very difficult thing to distinguish from the basic costs of infrastructure that should be carried by the institution. And what we require is, in order to pay, that there is transparency from the side of the institution about how they calculate costs of their infrastructure. So we're currently into negotiations with different universities on how they do their infrastructure costs calculation. Okay, so if you want to buy apparatus or equipment, you know that we also have the REKIP instrument, which begins from 100,000 francs on. So if you want something smaller, you have to include it in project funding, or you don't ask for it at all. But if it fits your project, it can have any size you want, but of course it needs to be proportionate with your project goals. So project funding is clearly not the instrument, you know, to buy equipment, but it's to integrate equipment if it fits into the project. And so if you go beyond 100,000 francs, you have to follow the same rules as in the REKIP instrument, meaning there has to be a co-financing by the institution. Okay? Costs of travel, of course, project partner subcontracting, we also went through that. This is also new, computing time, access to data. And then operating expenses are clearly things that have to be looked at, but there is a list in the implementation rules which gives you a kind of a negative list of things that we certainly don't fund or pay, such as computer hardware, standard electricity, telephone, and so on. Okay. Now, this is about career measures. So these career measures are for staff that are employed in the SNSF projects. So the 120 support grant is the following deal. If somebody, for a family reason, has to reduce working time, for example, go from 100 to 80% as a postdoc, then she normally, but in some cases also he, can ask an additional 20 salary % from the SNSF in order to employ somebody who will, keep on, be an additional support in the project if you have to reduce your working time. If you don't want that, you can ask for a support for childcare. So this is something that is already running. Then also the mobility for PhD students. If you employ PhD students on your project, and if it fits well with your project goals, you can have from 6 months to 12 months your PhD student, for example, working in the lab of somebody else. Okay. Then we have the gender equality things that you can apply for, so you can include as eligible project costs all kinds of measures that serve women to get on with their academic career, can go from mentoring over coaching to career development and so on. And these things are not foreseeable, so meaning that normally you don't apply for it at the beginning of your grant, but there is a very simple mechanism which will still be simplified where you can ask for these things and once the grant is running. Okay, then it goes still further. So we're doing 2 pilots. This has not started yet, but we'll start in October. So there's a pilot project for the social sciences and humanities, because in social sciences and humanities there's often the problem that people have a very high teaching load and that they don't have the time to dedicate to the research project. So the last slide I show you, everything was for project staff. What I show you now is for applicants. Okay, so if you're an applicant in social sciences, humanities, you can ask the SNSF for a grant for exemption from teaching duties. Amounts and all of that are listed here, but of course your institution has to approve that. So the SNSF will not take the decision if that fits into the teaching program of the institution, but of course it's the institution to tell us this. Okay, this is a pilot because in principle we believe that the institutions should do that. So like to give a kind of incentive that they may do it in the future. This is a pilot restricted until 2019, and then we'll see if it had some effect. Okay, then there's another pilot for clinicians. So if you're in an active clinician, you can have the following deal if you apply for it and it gets granted. The aim is that 30% of the working time of clinicians can be dedicated to research if the person is applicant of a research project. And here the deal is that SNSF and employer, the hospital, they come up for these 30%, the SNSF for 50% and the employer for the other 50%. And this is really for young people. And they have to work at eligible Swiss hospitals as defined by the Swiss law. And it must be a project in biology and medicine, not for other purposes. Okay. So this is what also came up before. It was the question, if I have planned for a PhD, can I employ somebody else? So yes, in principle. So the rule will be that the SNF gives global budgets, meaning what you get now is you get so much in this year, so much in this year, so much in this year, the year 1, 2, and 3. You have this position here, you have that position there. And so what you will get is an amount of money for year 1, an amount of money for year 2, and an amount of money for year 3. But of course, you have handed in a very detailed budget, and we have judged your project on the basis also of this budget. So you cannot, like deviate in any way you want from your research goals and from employing the things you get from the SNSF really for reaching the research goals. But within this framework, you have all kinds of liberty to change things en cours de route if it seems more appropriate for you in order to follow up with the project goals. But in any case, I mean, if you really do a large deviation from what you have originally planned, not only in terms of personnel, but in terms of, the direction the research and the project takes, in any case, better to inform the SNSF of that. So it doesn't mean that all projects come with a global budget. So there will be exceptions certainly, because in some cases there are conditions that are linked to a grant. For example, if the Research Council has decided to fund the project but not this specific item, then you will get a remark that you cannot buy this specific item because the scientific reasoning behind it, for example, wasn't good. But so the rule will be the global budgets. Now, I still do the employment of staff, and then we come to questions. So we're going to change the category of employees, and this is also in order to be able to identify real postdocs better. So at the moment we have PhD students, and we have the group of people that have a PhD, and then we have others. And so what we're going to do in the future, but it's not ready yet, is that there are PhD students and then there are postdocs, meaning people that are employed in the project with the aim of pursuing their academic career, of qualification for an academic career, or for another career. And we have the other employees, for example, people that have certain skills and just give a hand for the project for 1 year, for 2 years, or for 3 years, or whatsoever. So the career measures, for example, that we have, they only apply to the postdocs, the 120% and so on, okay, and not to the rest of the staff. Okay, so this is going to come up. Now, this comes back to the question that was asked here before. In the terms of the report of the Federal Council, much attention was paid to the fact that people shouldn't stay too long on certain stages in their academic career in order to have better perspectives later on. And the philosophy of the SNSF is do your PhD and then try to get independent as quickly as possible. So don't stay employed as a postdoc on an SNSF project too long. That's not good for you. Okay, so in this framework we say, okay, doctoral students, for both and for postdocs, there is a point in time when the clock starts to run, and then there's a time interval in which the person can be employed in an SNSF project. So with the PhD student, and I'll come to the exceptions right afterwards. So for PhD students, the point in time is the matriculation at the institution. That has not changed. These are current SNSF rules since years. Okay? And what is new is that we introduce kind of the same thing for the postdocs. So the clock starts to count when you have your PhD defense, and then you can be employed for a maximum of 5 years in an SNSF project. Okay? So there's this reference point in time, and then there's a time interval. Of course, if a university says, here in our institution you can only be employed for 4 years, then the SNSF will respect that. As I said before, it's always the more severe regulation that counts. Okay, and one thing is also that in the list of further staff, we are sometimes faced with a situation that people are continuously financed via SNSF projects, particularly in the technical domain. So we are aware of the fact that there's a certain need, and we do agree to finance technicians, but we don't agree to finance them lifelong. So that's the responsibility of the institution. Okay, so now the exceptions. We are very well aware of the fact that people have to enroll in some kind of graduate schools, for example, 1 year before they start to work on their project. And this is specifically the case in the social sciences and humanities. You can think of it what you like, if you like it or not, but we take it into account. So meaning that you can kind of postpone this reference point in time for at most 1 year. So we say 1 year is okay, you can have been 1 year in a graduate school and not have started working on a project, but then it's okay. And you can also have other reasons like care duties, parental leave, illness, and whatsoever. So at most you can delay this point in time for 1 year. And of course this also applies for the postdocs, but it does certainly not apply to the mandatory graduate schools. And so these reasons that I just listed, except the mandatory graduate schools, they can also happen to you if you're employed in a project and the project is running. So the project can be have a prolongation, cost neutral, for 1 year if it's okay with the grant holder, and so you can just extend the grant for a longer period. And the maximum there is also 1 year. So it's kind of the message is we do career measures for the people employed in order to cope with all kinds of family situations and so on, but we do want them to move on quickly to their next career stage. Okay, so I think it's the time to take questions. Okay, so I think it's the time to take questions. Okay.
Yes. I have a question concerning staff with non-permanent position.
Okay.
So how can I count that in my project? If I know that the technician, for example, has a contract of only 2 years, is it possible to run my project with this person? You know, a technician that is only with a non-permanent position.
Tu veux répondre? Je comprends. Okay, so as I said, I'm not sure if I got your question correctly. So you want to employ a technician for 2 years on a project?
No, I would like to have it for my 4 years project.
Yes.
But the contract of, for example, EPFL is only for 2 years. I don't know if I will be able to extend the contract. It's not sure. What can I do?
Okay, so in principle, we can discuss that afterwards because it seems to be a specific case, but the principle is we do employ technicians, but we always respect the rules at your institution. But let's discuss that later perhaps because maybe a specific case. So there was somebody here?
Thanks. I have a question about the new fact that you have in the other category of staff, also people with PhDs. And so they PhDs, they're not called postdocs. So what in practice will these people be doing? And isn't that been a way to have two statuses of postdocs, those who are called the postdocs and those who are called something else?
Okay, so that's clearly not what we want to see, you know, people having their 5 years as a postdoc and then, you know, being put in the other category. We will watch that very closely. But there are things that these people can do. For example, I think in biology and medicine there were examples of people of a PhD that have important skills and that help like with these skills in project. I don't know if you want to give an example or Stephanie?
Yeah, there is, for example, people having special skills with special methodology that are very highly needed for the realization of the projects, like bioinformatics, for example, or genomics, or yeah, that are some examples.
So it was specifically in the biology and medicine sector where it was felt that it was very important to keep this possibility, but there was a large discussion in the Research Council on that, and we said we have to have an eye on that because we don't want it to be counteractive to what we really, to our intentions.
The 5-year rule will hold for this too, that you cannot jump.
No, in the other categories there's no rule, and as now. And so if somebody is really on a qualification line, should go postdoc position, can benefit from the career measures and so on, and if somebody just gives a hand for a project, he should go or she should go in the other categories, but you should not. If we see that you start keeping people in that category on a project, we'll contact you. I don't know who was first. Yes?
Je me permets de poser ma question en français.
Oui, volontiers.
Celle précédente. Est-ce qu'il y a un moyen, une possibilité d'engager un postdoc qui, en raison du délai maximum, ne pourrait être postdoc que 1 à 2 ans et ensuite passer comme collaborateur, comme autre employé?
Voilà, alors je crois que notre but, il est clair, c'est de ne pas prolonger les années qu'une personne fait sur un projet fonds national ou sur des projets fonds national. Mais c'est clair que toute règle peut être contournée et ça, à mon avis, ça serait un peu limite. Alors, mais il y a des situations assez spécifiques où, par exemple, un postdoc, il a fait pendant 2 ans, il a fait autre chose, etc. C'est une question de discussion après. Mais le message, je crois qu'il est clair. C'est pas bien pour les postdocs de passer trop d'années sur un projet fonds national. Ils ont meilleur temps d'aller dans Ambition et demander leur propre subside de recherche en leur nom. Voilà.
So you said you don't pay permanent position, right?
So there are very different situations. Okay, for example, when we go to the universities of applied science, they have technicians that they employ as permanent contracts, but the money needs to come from third parties. It's not there at the institution. So there we say, okay, we accept to see these people once in a while on an SNSF project, but we don't want to see them on an SNSF project all along. And that's like kind of the same thing. And at the universities, the situation is often worse in the sense that the people don't even have a working contract. So they do kind of, you know, they hop from one SNSF project to the other. And we think that's not a good situation, because if they do such a good service to different researchers at an institution all the way, they should be employed by the institution. Okay, so that's our problem.
So I can put a technician with permanent position on this type?
Yeah, but you have to be very careful of that, because the SNSF does not take the social responsibility for these people. Because very often then, if it goes wrong, then afterwards we're contacted and we're asked, you know, to find a solution for the person, and that is clearly not our job.
And then you said we are flexible with using the money, so instead of using one type of person, we can use another one. But then it means the salary is not the same. So how are we going to do it?
Who wants to reply to that question? That's about global budgets. So.
You have the flexibility to use the money, but with flexibility comes responsibility. And it's up to you to decide how you want to use the money in the framework of the eligible costs we have and in the framework of the decision that has been taken by the research council. And as long as it has as an objective to reach your scientific goals, then you have the flexibility to use the funds in the framework of what is the eligible cost here. But once again, if the consequence is to pay a person permanently on different projects, 20% here, 20% there, it is not the objective of the SNSF to pay those kind of positions.
Okay.
I'd like to come back on the duration of the PhDs. There are cases here at EPFL where this duration is extended by EPFL rules. It is academically possible to extend beyond 4 years. And very often this happens because of some unforeseen reasons, or not of the kind that you have listed. For example, a big research facility that undergoes a maintenance time which was unforeseen. And that can make the duration of PhDs longer without anybody being truly responsible. I mean, is there a way out of this in your regulations? And more generally, I mean, I think that I mean, in ETH, the maximal duration of PhD is 6 years according to their ordinance. I mean, here at EPFL it's 4, but it's academically possible to extend. I expect the situation is the same in other universities. So where do you take your 4 years from? It seems to be at odds with most academic regulations Swiss-wide.
No, I don't think so.
6 years, I have the ordinance of ETH. I am on admit.ch. At ETH it's 6 years. Huh? Yeah.
Any 4 years of the 6. I don't understand why you decide one PhD should be awarded. Why SNF matters? Why SNF matters when a PhD is granted? This is a problem of EPFL or ETH, right? Your problem is you don't want to pay more for it than 4 years, which is totally reasonable. But when these 4 years are, I don't understand why it matters for you.
Okay, so you can look at the statistics Europe-wide, which say that in many domains you're between 4 and 5 years. And the 4 years are not only for the PhD students, but we also did a survey on the running time of research projects that researchers have. And there was like kind of a bimodal distribution, with one about 4 to 5 years and the other one then at 10 years or something like that. Plus people having very short time projects. Okay, so these are the reasons behind the 4 years. And also, as I said before, 3 years is clearly too short for a PhD. So we are not saying that institutions have to give PhDs after 4 years. We say we finance them for 4 years, and then you have to see where you find the rest, because we are not a project for a researcher is something where you give funds for a certain research proposal, and then it's the responsibility of the researcher to look for the staff that is appropriate for carrying out the research. But we do have the idea that PhD students should not stay PhD students too long.
This is exactly the point. You say you should find the person that is most adapted. The most adapted person may be a person that has been on PhD for 1 year and a half. And he will not pay for years, even if it is the best project in the world. And I don't understand, again, why.
Okay, but I would like to doubt that EPFL would pay your PhD student for 6 years.
We have PhD students that are paid 6 years.
Okay, then you're absolutely accept. But I propose that we continue this afterwards with a coffee, because we still have a point. Okay. Yeah, I don't know who's first.
I have maybe one question on the 5-year postdoc rule. If I have a situation that I have a postdoc available that has been employed for 4 years on a EU project, for example, can I still employ him for 5 years on ESNF?
No, because as I said, there's a certain point in time which is the PhD defense. So the person should go for an Ambitionen grant, very clearly. You know, there's kind of complementarity of instruments, and we think that the person in this situation should come with his or her own grant. Okay, sorry, reacting too slowly.
So just 2 short questions. Maybe continuing on this extension of PhD students and other employees. It was written cost neutral, but if the employee or the PhD student has been on sick leave or childcare, or usually, at least at EPFL, there is no insurance. I mean, it's paid on the grant. So then it cannot be cost neutral. So I find it a bit weird.
Who wants to reply to that one?
I can reply. So in kind of a motherhood or maternity leave, it's clear that it's not cost neutral, because you have the insurance, so they pay 80%, and the SNFS pays at the end of the project pays the lasting 20%. So this is not cost neutral.
So then it doesn't enter in the, because I don't know, on the slide it was written that it should be cost neutral.
Yes, with that exception.
Yes.
If someone is on maternity leave, then of course it's not cost neutral.
And just the other quick question was about the flexibility of to use funds. Does it change anything in the application? One has to still, I mean, ask for an amount for equipment, an amount for salaries, or then is it just asking for a total amount? And
in the application, you have to tell us what you want to do. You have to tell us how you want to use the money. And therefore you have to tell us who will be hired, not the person, but is it a PhD, is it a postdoc, or a technician? You have to tell us if you need an equipment, which equipment you want to have, and why you need those kind of equipment. And this is part of the evaluation to know whether it makes sense, the kind of money you are requesting. And that has to be, as it is now, defined.
Okay. There's one here and then one there, and I think then we have to move on, because then afterwards, let's do it that way. We're a couple of people, so you're much faster of getting an answer if you ask one of these people. So let's take 2 questions and then let's move on.
Thank you. I have a question about the mobility of the PhD students. You have talked about the PhD students that they are in projects, but I'm thinking about, for example, who that they are .ch or .mobility. What happens to that? Because I have heard that there would be some changes in the possibility of mobility during PhD.
Maybe let's discuss that also later, because there's going to be more information about that, but these are changes that will come in a couple of years. So that's not really, there's nothing fundamental that is going to change in the next 2 or 3 years. Okay. Then there was one here, and then,
For the projects funded in the last round, do they run on the old regulations for the whole length of the project?
In principle, yes. But for example, we don't take away rights that you have acquired with your old projects. So for example, if you have been somebody who would not be eligible under the new rules, we let your project come to an end. But for example, the other way around it works too. If you want to, you haven't applied for, let's say, cloud computing costs, because at the time they weren't eligible, you can hand in the bill on cloud computing costs at the end of your project. So we try to be very flexible with that. But the rule of thumb is you don't take away old rights, but in the way possible, you allow people to benefit from the new rules. Okay? Yeah?
Maybe I can compliment and say, if you are hiring a person, say 2nd of October, and this person is a postdoc after the 5 years, it will not be possible, even in a grant that has started in the past. And those kind of points in the regulation will be enforced even on the old on the already running grants. But for instance, on the other side, the flexibility in the use of funds. If the Research Council didn't put any constraint in the use of funds in the allocation he gave, then we will give you the full flexibility as we will do for future grants.
Even for the teaching reduction, for example.
Oh, that is the person.
No, so it's an exception. The teaching reduction is only for that, the amount we give. And it will be written in the decision.
Okay, so I suggest we move on, and then afterwards we will still be there until 12, and you can ask us all kinds of questions. And there's only one slide to go, which is about Synergia. There was already an information event about Synergia here. I don't know if it was the same public as today, but Synergia is new in several aspects. So there are 3 things we would like to promote with Synergia. It's collaborative research, so different researchers and their group should collaborate. It's supposed to be interdisciplinary. That's a constraint that we didn't have before. And it should have a breakthrough character, meaning that people should really like to try to go for very new things. We hope that this definition is clearer than it was before, but because what happened before was people that had very many projects very similar to what they were already doing in project funding. So here with this instrument, we would really like to encourage people that work together with other disciplines, come up with entirely new ideas. So in order also to have a funding portfolio which is clear, we will not have these individual interdisciplinary project grants anymore. They will be merged into this new Synergia program, so meaning that the interdisciplinary networks there can be of all size. The smallest one is like a collaboration between 2 researchers, and the largest one is like 4 applicants and their groups. So the maximum size that we see here is 3.2 million francs. And we grant funds for 4 years. The eligibility and the eligible costs and everything is exactly the same thing as in project funding, and people are already writing their grants because the next deadline is June 2016. And I forgot to present Laura before. This comes to my mind now because Laura, she's the specialist for Synergia. I'm sorry, Laura, I think I forgot you before. And so if you have questions on Synergia, you should ask Laura. So this is about Synergia. And perhaps one word about the regulations. In principle, we are fully under the new regime now. So the last call for project funding still under the old regime was in April, and so now all of the proposals in project funding that are prepared and in all the other instruments, they have to comply with the new rules. Okay, so I thank you very much for your attention, and what we hope to do with this innovation is have very flexible project funding and for very different needs in research. And as I said before, do visit our website P3, interactive now. You can have a look at all kinds of funding and numbers. And so I would like to close the session in this way, and you just come forward and ask us all the questions that you'd like to ask. So thank you for your attention.